come across that indeed the defense or Derek Chauvin is blaming the death of George Floyd on the bystanders, four of whom were children?
No question that's one of Nelson's defenses here, the angry mob defense. We didn't see any of that during jury selection. We thought he was going to go down the drug route or the heart disease route or both. Seems like it's primarily drugs. But almost every law enforcement witness on the stand, Nelson's cross-examination has focused on this angry mob and the fact that Chauvin was unable to render aid and release the pressure because of this mob. So he's really going all in on this defense. And I really think that he has to, Linda, because again, this isn't a case where an officer made a split-second decision to pull the trigger. He applied that pressure for more than 9 minutes, including several minutes after Floyd was already responsive. Now, we're not going to Floyd's intent here. And in this specific case, when the EMTs picked up Floyd, they actually moved him to a location where they tried to render aid. And at least from the defense's perspective, that's relevant. That goes to that angry mob theory that even the EMTs thought it was unsafe or inappropriate to render aid, either because of the bystanders or because of traffic in that area. So I think it is fair game for cross-examination. It's clearly the defense theory of the case that Chauvin chose not to render aid.
In Los Angeles, especially when you were a former federal prosecutor. So using that experience here, would you be following this trial to see whether there's more interest in maybe some kind of drug connection through Maurice Hall, or is he just going to be considered a low-level dealer?
Well, certainly as a federal prosecutor, you have interest. You're looking for trafficking, and that was what I primarily did at the U.S. office. Whether it was drug trafficking, human trafficking, it's a significant problem, both methamphetamine and fentanyl. As far as Maurice Hall, a low-level dealer like that, unlikely to be prosecuted by the feds, but he does have exposure, especially in Minnesota. We've talked about that third-degree murder charge. We're beating a dead horse, but if you actually provide drugs to someone in Minnesota and they die, you can be charged for third-degree murder. So I understand why Hall's attorney is pleading the fifth here, but he will have to testify. And he's going to testify as to Floyd's demeanor and so forth. He's not going to testify to the drugs because Judge Cahill won't let him. Again, unless there's some immunity, state and federal level, he doesn't have.
He's really the person who had the bills, and he traded off with George Floyd. Hey, Maurice, I don't have enough money here. Can I get a 50 from you here? Here's or 20 from you. I'll give you a 10 in return. Wouldn't that help the prosecution?
Well, definitely Maurice Hall is implicated in both the counterfeit conspiracy, and we're also going to hear from, I believe, Shawanda, the other vehicle, potentially. But really, his exposure is drug-wise. That's where you get to the murder. Again, if I was the prosecution, I would really try to keep this door closed as much as possible. Courtney Ross, the girlfriend, already opened it. Remember, it's not just what happened on Memorial Day, May 2020. She testified that Maurice Hall was the one that gave both of them the drugs that resulted in Floyd's March 2020 overdose. So he's got exposure there as well for 2 different drug episodes and the counterfeit bills. Nelson is going to want to talk about the drugs, somehow get into the drugs. Judge Cahill won't let him. So he'll ask something about George Floyd's demeanor, his state of mind, something that really dances around the drug issue, which will potentially open the door. So the question will be, Linda, what was George Floyd's demeanor when he was sitting in the car and he was approached by workers from the store?
And the answer would be what? That he was expecting?
He was out of it. He was fidgety. He was high. Same thing that the witnesses testified to. That's the answer that he's going to want.
Taylor, tell me how this can now morph out of control. The witness now answers instead.
Yeah, well, I don't think they're going to be even allowed to ask that question. They're going to ask if he was sleeping or not in the car. And I think once he says yes, it's out of control.
Taylor, out of control. What would be the answer that you think that this question could morph into?
Yeah, I think it's going to be about why was he sleeping, and then it just goes down the road and it's over.
What road?
You start talking about drugs. Why was he sleeping? I saw him take drugs. What did he take? When did he take it? And then it never ends.
So, Neama, prosecution wants to ask a question. What question do they ask, expecting what answer?
Prosecution, I don't think, wants to ask anything of Maurice Hall. But if they do, they're going to steer as far away from the drugs as possible, focus on either the counterfeit bills or anything that doesn't go to causation, or the fact that he was otherwise calm and not resisting arrest.
Neama, can the prosecution cross on the question of what was George Floyd doing sleeping by saying something to the effect of, and did you think that the drugs caused his death, or was it the officer? Could the prosecution ask that?
Well, hopefully they don't, because the last thing you want to ask is a question that you don't know the answer to as a prosecutor, especially with a witness like this that has significant criminal exposure. So if I were the prosecution, I don't go anywhere near Maurice Hall and drugs and George Floyd.
And Taylor, we have 1 minute left, so you're going to get the final question and the final answer very quickly. So what question do you think the prosecutor wants, if any, from Maurice Hall, if any?
I mean, I think you would ask him, if any, keep in mind, because the answer is a dual serving purpose. If the question was what was asked before, did the police kill him or did the drugs kill him? If Maurice Hall is going to answer, of course he's going to say the police, anything away from the drugs, because the drugs leads to that possible murder 3 charge to him. So it would not be a surprise at all if given the opportunity that Maurice Hall would point as many fingers in the direction of the police as humanly possible.
Why isn't that the question? Or was the redirect effective by just doing what he should be doing, which is asking about the procedure?
Linda, I agree with you. Maybe because we're a little bit more animated. I just don't like how the state has handled this case. In jury selection was the opposite, right? You had Nelson kind of going on and on and on with these prospective jurors, then he used a peremptory and they would be on their way. Unnecessary waste of time. But last week, even with the foundational witnesses, we saw the prosecution just go on and on and on. And they're doing the same thing this week with the law enforcement officers. I mean, at this point, the jury is bored beyond belief. There's no ups and downs. There's no emphasis. And they've heard everything they need to know about the training that the Minneapolis Police Department offers, how it was, and it doesn't apply to this case. I think the state needs to move on and needs to really cut a lot of these witnesses short, because really it's overkill here and they're losing their jury.
Why don't you go to specifics? Is there some prohibition I'm missing?
No, I agree with you, Linda. And, kind of goes back to the evidence that we should emphasize. Well, we talked about the thank you that George Floyd did, and I know you've been tweeting about it. But really, it's that stare off into the distance. It's what Chauvin did and didn't do and what he said and didn't say. That's the relevant information. No, this isn't someone that was scared of an angry mob. This isn't someone that chose not to render medical aid or release the pressure on George Floyd because he was worried about being attacked or assaulted by these bystanders. We don't see any of that, and that's what the state should have emphasized during direct and redirect.
When the jury is listening to this testimony in relation to whether or not Derek Chauvin's actions were justifiable against George Floyd, what do you think is the one question they would want to ask?
The same question that Nelson asked, why did the EMS move George Floyd before they started to render aid? And again, he got that same point home, the bystanders, the traffic. We talked about aid, and really the issue is, when should Derek Chauvin have started CPR, those compressions? And during cross-examination, McKenzie did admit that it may have been the best course of action to start that when George Floyd was away from that scene.